Hi, this is Yael here. We're just going to wait a few more minutes to let some more people join. So if you can be patient, we'll just kick it off in another minute or two. Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I am just going to kick it off right now. My name is Yael Bridge. I go by she, her. I am wearing a green shirt and have clear glasses. And I believe I'm calling in from Baloney Land in Oakland, California. I am a documentary filmmaker. I work as a director and a producer. My most recent film, The Big Scary S Word, it's about the history and resurgence of socialism in the United States. And I'm currently in post-production on a short about the UTLA LA teachers strike from a few years back that I hope to be finally finishing sometime this year. The way this is going to work is we're going to all introduce ourselves, and then we're going to talk in the first half about what's going on in I.A.T.S.E right now, and then we're going to talk in the second half more specifically about documentary and independent film and the way that we are organized or unorganized and how we can support each other in general and I.A.T.S.E specifically. We also will be taking questions. We have some questions that people submitted before, and we'll also be taking questions as they come in, and you can submit those through the chat, or more helpful would be the Q&A option at the bottom of the Zoom. So I will hand it off to Eliza.
Hello, thank you. I am Eliza Moley. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm calling in from unceded Tongva land, also known as Los Angeles. I am a young white woman with fake blonde hair, sitting in a white room with a bunch of frames on the wall behind me. I am a documentary producer. I fill various producing roles, primarily on films that kind of fall outside of the framework of / offer a critique of capitalism. And I will toss this to Chris.
Hello, I am Chris Renteria. I'm a producer and director and cinematographer, a member of a local 600 in the Central region, and also a member of the DPA. I've produced and directed and lensed several films and documentary. Most recently, St. Louis Superman, which was recently nominated for an Academy Award, as well as Who Streets, which was a 2017 opening night film at Sundance. I'm excited to be here, and I can't wait to get into this discussion. I'm going to pass it off. I apologize. I'll pass it off to, let's go to Lucas.
Hi, I'm Lucas Joaquin. I'm a producer. My pronouns are he, him. I'm calling in from Brooklyn, New York, which I believe is Lenape and Canarsie land. I am a producer, independent film producer, mostly narrative features, based in New York. And I'm also a part of the executive committee of the Producers Union, which is an organization that has just been formed this year to represent independent producers who don't have any sort of guild organization to represent for collective bargaining. Yeah, and I'm glad to be here. And I'll pass it off to Matthew.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Borek. My pronouns are he, him. I am calling in from the San Fernando Valley, Southern California, which is formerly Chumash land. I am on a stage, and therefore, being in public space, will be wearing a mask throughout the call. I work exclusively as an assistant camera person in narrative television, commercials, music videos, and episodic television and features. And I'm very excited to be here and a part of this conversation. Thank you to the DPA for having me. I will pass it off to, last but not least, Sam Petrov.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sam Petrov. I'm calling in, likewise, as Matt said, from Chumash land, which is San Fernando Valley, Los Angeles, California. I'm wearing a black shirt, black hat with the local 600 insignia on it, and a blurred background. And my pronouns are he, him, his. I am a local 600 member under I.A.T.S.E, just like Matt and Chris. And I am a digital imaging technician, and very involved with the local and the union in general, and I'm very excited to be able to share my insights if I'm able to on this call for anything regarding I.A.T.S.E and anything on the crew side of things.
Thank you all so much for being here. I would love to introduce the DPA at this point. So the DPA was established in 2016. It is a diverse coalition of more than 400 members, setting standards for inclusive, sustainable, and equitable documentary practices, amplifying the voice of documentary producers worldwide, and educating the industry about producers' essential role. We want to acknowledge our founding supporter, Genuine Article Pictures, the Sundance Institute, and our fiscal sponsor, the Film Collaborative, at this point. Chris now has some words to say regarding Helena Hutchins.
Yeah, before we get started, I definitely want to take up some time here to have a couple words and also a moment of silence for Helena. We're extremely heartbroken and devastated to learn that Helena Hutchins died a couple days ago, the 21st, actually yesterday, from injuries sustained on the set while working as a DP on Rust. Our entire alliance mourns. It's an incredible loss, and our hearts go out to Helena's family, friends, and the entire Rust crew. So if we can just take a moment. Thank you all for allowing us to have that space.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to jump into the conversation, starting with a specific focus on I.A.T.S.E. So welcome, Matt, Sam, and Chris, and thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. The first question that we have is just pretty broad in general, which is, can you give us some background on I.A.T.S.E? What is it? What is its purpose?
I'm happy to start this conversation off. The I.A.T.S.E, or International Alliance of Theater and Stage. Oh, Sam, is it?
International Alliance of Theater and Stage
Employees, right. Is a 125-year-old union labor organization that began on the East Coast to represent stage persons working in theater, and has broadened its scope over time to include those that work in the motion picture side as well. They cover predominantly below the line crew in motion picture, which is how we'll focus our conversation today, representing persons who work with cameras like myself, Sam, and Chris, persons who work with props or do wardrobe. There's a wide variety of technical crew positions that are covered by the union, and we are represented by IA President Matt Loeb, and then each individual local also is broken down into a board with presidents and directors and other executive officers. Collective bargaining is a powerful way to ensure that the voice of labor is heard on set. Sam, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. So yeah, obviously the film arm of it came about when film started coming out in the early 20th century, and since then the locals have started to kind of, as Matthew kind of alluded, they've kind of been grouped based on craft. So like there's a camera local, and there's the sound local, and there's the local for editors of film and video now, and some of those locals are national, like ours. So we actually cover, the same ground as the entire country. So for example, Chris is in the same local as we are because they've merged in the past. So we're national local, but a lot of locals are actual locals. Most of them are actual locals. So it only covers a certain geographic jurisdiction in a certain region. But other than that, yeah, we have a strong history. We've obviously come into the public eye a little bit more recently because of our recent negotiations and where we've been in terms of trying to leverage our collective power, as any union does, to achieve a contract that represents our intent and really just the safety and safety, wages, and benefits of members, which is what we're always fighting for as trade unions. But that's kind of our background, and we're happy to be here today to share our insights.
Oh, Chris, were you going to say something? Okay. Well, that leads into like what's going on now. Why are you guys threatening to strike, or what's going on with the strike authorization, and like what's going on with the working conditions? Why were they? Could you describe what they're like and how bad they are, or great they are, if that might be the case?
Working conditions on set have changed dramatically in the digital era of filmmaking. Production schedules have become more and more aggressive. Budgets have gotten tighter and tighter. And the stress of completing productions has fallen onto the below the line crew more so than the above the line crew. Our hours have borderline, or ours have more than borderline, have moved into an unsafe territory where the idea of working beyond 12 to 14 and even 16-hour days has become a norm, especially in episodic television and narrative features. It's very challenging when you are bargaining for benefits, healthcare and pension. Every round of negotiations, you're having to fight to keep what benefits you have and to try and bolster them, especially as the healthcare system in the US flaunters in the way that it does. And we are currently in a unique situation in time, given the coronavirus pandemic and how that has influenced the way that we do business. Everyone took a giant step back for a couple of months in 2020. And as they reapproached working in production, it caused a moment of reflection in thinking, is there a better way for us to work? May we have better work-life balance? May we see our families and friends more? Do we have to wholly commit our entire selves, our lives, to working in production? Or is there the possibility that we can work in production and have lives at home at the same time? And these negotiations in particular, the members of I.A.T.S.E and the area standards agreements, of which there are approximately 60,000 persons, wanted to see our quality of life improve. Normally, we go over the past 20 or 30 years into contract negotiations, hoping to improve our wages, assure our benefits are going to be upheld, and end story. If we can make sure that wages continue to not stagnate and that our benefits are not taken away from us, we considered that a win. But especially over the past 10 years, our quality of life has been in decline due to the unsafe hours that we've been putting in on set. And so this round, we fought very hard for language in the contracts, which will aid us in having better rest periods and turnaround times over the weekend, being able to take breaks, to have meals. You know, the productions had begun to not even allow certain crews to break for lunch, just to continue the working day. And so having stiffer penalties around not breaking for lunch in order to dissuade productions from doing that became a focus. And then bringing up wages for certain classifications that were barely getting a livable wage became another big fight that we were having. You know, it was challenging for us to look internally and say, we have members who are making $16 or $17 an hour, and that's not how we want to see a union, a collective bargaining agreement done, to have these persons struggling paycheck to paycheck, but part of a union. And so there was a big focus on them acquiring a more livable wage, and it's going to happen incrementally if this current tentative agreement is ratified, but it's a step in the right direction. Sam, from the back end of it, because you and I do different jobs, right? I'm on set, and so when they call wrap, I kind of finish my day and go home. But oftentimes, Sam, being a digital imaging technician, has more work to do at the end of the day. And so, do you have anything additionally that you'd like to add to this?
I don't think from that perspective specifically. I think we are all on very similar boats across the board, which is why we were able to achieve a lot of the things we did in this cycle of negotiations, because what we did is we unified from the kind of the common denominator standpoint. So we figured out what were all the locals and what were all of the members, I.A.T.S.E wide in the film industry specifically, seeking out of this negotiation and just out of the union in general. And that's where we were able to build what we call the IA solidarity movement, meaning I.A.T.S.E solidarity. And that was about basically finding the things that we all cared about, which were, as Matthew said, the lowest minimum wage that we have in our contracts, and things like safety and benefits. Like I said, these are all hallmark things of any labor or trade union organization. So these were things that we're all able to band together on and stay united on, which is what made us so strong in this cycle of negotiations. And it's something that we obviously want to maintain going forward as we negotiate in the future. So I think those are the things that are more important to point out, more so than individual classifications at this point, just because we all have those issues, because we are seeing the repercussions of a digital film era and the repercussions of the disparity between the massive conglomerates that run our industry. I know this is different for documentary, but for our industry, we're basically dictated in a lot of ways by massive companies that are not even the traditional theatrical and exhibition companies or production companies like the studios. We're now being transitioned to a new era of technology companies and Silicon Valley startups that have now just grown within just the matter of a few decades to a point of having more dominance than a studio that's been around for a century. So that's kind of the situation, to put some context on it in terms of where we're at and in terms of where we stand as a local organization as well as a national organization. And I think it's important just to kind of highlight those significant changes in the industry, because those have, as Matthew said, in the last decade or two, really just the last decade especially, really caused us to encounter issues that were not previously as detrimental to our health and to our safety on a regular basis as they are now. I guess I'd ask Chris if he has anything specific to add as far as that side of it goes.
No, I think that was great. I think y'all covered a lot of ground, but I also want to just add in that there were some DEI, diversity and inclusion things that were adopted as well. And I just wanted to point those out. And also kind of, this is a segue, but, I wanted to mention that, we did get MLK Jr.'s birthday as a holiday. There was pushback on that, which is a great addition, but also the adoption of diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives, which we're still learning slowly about as details are being released. But I did want to just point out too that I was, and maybe it was just the way it was laid out, but those things were kind of falling towards the back. And so we want to continue just to kind of push those things up to the front as well, so we can keep looking at that. But I definitely wanted to talk more about that as we segue into our next question, Yael, with Lucas, if you want to lead into that.
Oh, well, before we get to Lucas, I wanted to just hear, like, if you could just summarize where we're at with the negotiations now, because I know, right, like like the headlines a few days ago were like, oh, settled, like they struck a deal, everything is done. Is that true? Is it all done?
You want to take it, Matt?
I can start it, or you can. The process the same as I do.
Go for it.
It's a step-by-step process. The first is bargaining. The stage of the process that we're in right now is we have a tentative agreement, and the members of the bargaining committee or the members of the local, or the bargaining unit, will now vote to either ratify or reject the contract. If the contract is ratified, then it will go into effect. Typically, there's certain aspects of it, like wages, that will be backdated, but then other aspects of it, like working conditions, will be put into effect anywhere from 30 to 90 days later. If the contract is rejected, then we will re-enter negotiations with the AMPTP, and that will be completely uncharted territory for us. We have never had a contract rejected. I cannot speculate, because no one can at this juncture say if the contract is rejected, what would happen next, outside of the next step in the process. If that were to be what happens, would be continuing to negotiate.
I guess, yeah, and just for context, I would say that we've also already entered uncharted territory in a lot of ways in this negotiation cycle. So just for context, we negotiate every 3 years, and for full transparency, we have a number of different contracts under I.A.T.S.E for film specifically, and this is the major one called the Basic Agreement, and it's obviously the most members who work under this contract for the actual chunk of our membership who are working under union contracts are under this contract. But and it also sets the precedent in a lot of ways, formally and informally, for the stuff that we get in other contracts that are for other types of genres, like music videos or commercials, which are separate agreements, but in a lot of ways look up to this agreement during their bargaining cycles and say, hey, look what we got or what we didn't get in that major agreement, and here's what we can and can't really kind of ask for and feel comfortable asking for in this other agreement that we're negotiating. As well, we've also been negotiating for a period of five months now. So we started in May, usually goes a couple months, and a lot of it is in leadership's hands, both of the local leadership and the national, being the I.A.T.S.E leadership, who go to the bargaining table on our behalf, and they're the ones who actually bring the proposals to the employers and say, this is what members are asking for, this is what we're fighting for, this is what we're standing for. And typically it's kind of a back and forth for a few months, and then a lot of times in the past we will come back, or they'll come back to the membership and say, here's our tentative agreement, and that'll be that. This time's been a lot more dramatic in a lot of ways, obviously, as you've seen in headlines, and we have been going a lot longer than normal because the employers were refusing to agree. And also, like I said earlier, kind of as I alluded, we have a lot more solidarity this time around, or at least it feels like that, because we're getting a lot of the major issues that we're all feeling. And it's not just, oh, local 600, who's camera, they have issues of their particular job in this, like a camera operator, certain stipulations they want. No, we're really focusing on the larger issues here of everybody's affected by how much turnaround time we have. Everyone's affected by being someone going on a commute home after a 17-hour day and potentially dying because of that. Like, these are all major, again, lowest denominator issues, which is really important because that allows us to leverage our power as a larger group. The bigger and the more people you can get involved with the relevant issue, obviously the stronger you are, rather than just saying, well, camera operators, obviously that's a chunk of people, but it's not, anything compared to larger membership of the I.A.T.S.E film arm. So with that being said, we did get to a point where we were basically, we got to a point where we had to vote to authorize the strike, which again, like Matthew said, even with the ratification, we've never gotten to even that point. So we had to vote as the bargaining unit, which is the Los Angeles and kind of the Western region area. We had to vote as a unit, as all the locals. So there were 13 different locals under I.A.T.S.E, and all of those locals members had to then together vote whether we would authorize to even approve a strike if we needed to. And so that's what we did with the record turnout and a record yes vote. And so we had that power and leverage. Basically, we gave that to Matt Loeb, our chief negotiator and the I.A.T.S.E president, to go into the bargaining room after months of not getting anywhere and kind of stalling. And we told them, look, if you have to, call for a strike, or if nothing else, use that as leverage so we can say that we're willing to walk off and withhold our labor if it becomes, that critical. And so he went back to the bargaining table with that as a tool. He wielded that tool, and basically within a week, it didn't happen right away, but within a few days of having that ability, or at least again, that power over the employers, basically said, the employers eventually gave in to what we were asking for, which again, were all very universal asks. They weren't anything specific to locals for the most part, which is why we had the leverage, because all the locals banded together. They oftentimes try to pick us apart, which is a very common strategy in labor union negotiations of, oh, camera guys want this, or camera women want this, and they, we'll give that to them, but we won't give something to the editors. It's like, no, this time we were all very unified because, again, we used very intentionally and strategically the lowest common denominator argument. And so it's like, well, if you don't give us 12-hour turnaround, it's like, that's a no deal. Or, whatever we were asking for. In this case, I think it was 10-hour turnaround. So things like that were asks that we were able to apply across the board and really hit home. And again, allowed us not only to bring in the largest number of members, but also allow us to have that leverage over the employers, because we knew that across the board, everyone wanted these things. Everyone cares about having a quality of life. Everyone cares about having benefits. Everyone cares about having a wage that is, one, livable, and also in terms of the raises over the course of the contract period, we're all interested in having those things. So that was another strategy. So going back to the timeline, we basically had the strike authorization vote. We ended up getting a tentative agreement, like Matthew said, and that's where we're at right now, where we have a tentative agreement. And again, it's not unique to us. This is the labor strategy and negotiations, where we have a tentative agreement. The membership then reviews that agreement. And then at that point, it's up to the membership in the bargaining unit to basically say, do we accept this agreement or do we reject the agreement? And obviously those have two very distinct outcomes. But like Matthew said, we've never been at a point where we've rejected an agreement as a total collective in the bargaining unit. So that would be uncharted territory. That would all be speculation at this point. Typically in our history, just for context, we get the tentative agreement. We have a certain period of time, which varies depending on how long it takes for the legalese to come out and for us to actually get something more substantive rather than just a few bullet points to vote, based on what we're seeing and what the language dictates for the next 3 years for us. And then at that point, we would say, yes, we agree with this. No, we don't. And in the past, we've always said yes. And it's like, it's based on the things that we've been fighting for the entire time. So a lot of times the membership is in agreement with what the leadership is asking for, because they ask for the things that we're already on board with. And then we see the stuff that they fought for on our behalf. And then we say, yes, this aligns with what we're asking for. And we go forward from there. And then that sets in motion a 3-year deal, which then we repeat that entire process in another 3 years. So that's where we're at in time in terms of timeline. Again, as Matthew said, this could extend beyond just a simple yes vote. If it were to hypothetically be voted no, then negotiations could resume. We could get more. We could often or very easily get a lot less than what we already have. But that's all speculation, and it would be a matter of actually seeing what the vote comes out to, and then we would go from there.
extremely well said. As you all know, and as everybody on the call is learning, this is like incredibly deep and complicated, and just a lot of legalese, and so much still is to come out. And so we're going to have obviously we don't have infinite amount of time to have this phone call, or this Zoom rather. Sorry, I just showed my age. But we are going to have a resource guide at the end of this where people can go and plug in. This is recorded, but we can also kind of have a deeper conversation with contacts and things of that nature. So I just kind of want to encourage everybody to go to that, do more research. Social media is great for learning about a lot of things, but sometimes information and politicking and lobbying and kinds of things like that can be a little confusing. So we'll be able to put that up for y'all later after this call. Thank y'all very much, guys. That was great.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Chris, for flagging that resource guide that we will be adding to after this to have some more general FAQs for people to be able to use as this moves forward. Because, right, we don't want to speculate. We don't know what will end up happening, where this TA will land. So I wanted to pivot us to generally just be talking with what's going on in I.A.T.S.E in general, to what we as independent documentary producers can do. And so I wanted to ask Lucas, as a representative of the Producers Union, if you could just talk a little bit about the Producers Union and how does it work, and what is that like?
Yeah, well, I mean, first I should say, and I'm thankful to be a part of this discussion and to have been invited here. I don't want, in pivoting to talking about the Producers Union, I don't want to take away in any way from the struggle that the I.A.T.S.E members are going through. And I think, as the Young Producers Union, we really support that fight and the fight to set very, clear, safe guidelines for I.A.T.S.E membership. The Producers Union is an organization that just started earlier this year. We are an organization that exists because there is no collective bargaining organization for producers. And as you can tell, the motion picture and television industry is one of the most heavily unionized businesses in America for its benefit. But almost everybody on a film set is a member in some way of a union or a guild. So the Screen Actors Guild, AFTRA, of course, dictates minimum fees and health benefit contributions for actors, the WGA for writers, the DGA for directors, assistant directors, and production managers. And of course, I.A.T.S.E for so many of the below the line crew positions. But we're one of the only positions involved in film that doesn't have a union representing us. And that means we don't have minimum fees. That means so that on every show, we have to negotiate our fees from the bottom up. And we're often asked to waive our fees because there's so much confusion over what producers do. And we're often linked up with the financiers, even though our job as supervisors is quite separate from that. But in that way, we're often asked to waive our fees, defer our fees. We have no healthcare contributions, so we have to pay into that. We have to pay into whatever healthcare we have from our own fees that we're getting. And often these fees are lump sums over the life of an entire show, of a life of an entire film. So that means through development, fundraising, casting a movie, pre-production, production, post-production, and then selling a movie. And often that can take 2 years or more. So we started the Producers Union to address that and to form an organization that can collectively bargain for those protections that everybody else in our business has and is able to fight for. And so we're a young organization. We had a vote of over 100 of our producing community earlier this year, and to form a constitution. And now we've formed an executive committee of 9 members who are from the producing community, and we're putting together a basic agreement that that addresses those things: minimum fees, arbitration, healthcare contributions from the financiers or of a show or movie, and creative rights protections for producers. So yeah, so that's who we are.
Great. I have lots of questions about sort of how that works. I think you did a really good job sort of explaining the tricky position that producers are in general, where we're like, there's a lot of confusion about us being like looped in with financiers, which, we're not. And also, like I was just on a union organizing call, and it was a question about like, if the boss does something, how would you organize? Like if they fired someone unfairly, and it's like, oh, this is really tricky because like, as the producer, I am the boss. And so it puts the producers in like a sort of tricky scenario anyway, of how it might map onto a union model or not.
And just to say on that, in that way, I think, one way to think about it too is that production managers, UPMs, are a member of the DGA, are members of the DGA, and they get, they have minimum fee protection, per diem, healthcare contributions, residuals, but those are supervisors, and they have the right to hire and fire and do all of those things that you say, and they're often making those decisions about call times and turnaround and everything. And so I think it is, it's clear that you can be a supervisory worker and still have those contributions, even though you're also making those decisions, if that makes sense.
Yes, it is possible. I don't know how to, I'm excited to see like how we can piece that together. And the producers union is just fiction films at this point.
Yeah, this is just fiction films at this point. And yeah, we want to start small and targeted so that we can create something. And then hopefully, we'd love to expand further. I know in New York, for instance, the commercial community I heard about earlier this week, production department that walked off of a set of a commercial because of the expectations that were being placed on them in terms of working hours and other expectations. So I think there's a similar, I think the feeling, this is all part of a similar groundswell of people who are involved in labor. Even if it is a supervisory position, we are workers, and we we're working for a wage, and this is part of a groundswell that you see all across the United States and the world, of people really wanting to get their fair share and make sure that they're not being placed in unsafe working conditions.
Yeah, I'm wondering, and this is sort of for all of us, everyone can pop in and answer. I'm wondering about the implications of what's going on with the I.A.T.S.E and their pending strike, and what those implications are for documentary and independent producers currently in production. I don't know. What do you think?
Is that a question for me? So
yeah, anyone could answer.
Well, just to say, as with the producers union, we are currently, most of our membership, we're focusing on films. Most of the films that we're talking about would probably be films that would be under the tier contracts. So, under $15 million, we're talking about independent feature films. And right now, the members, people who would be working on, I.A.T.S.E members who would be working on tier movies that were signatory to the tier contracts would not be striking because those contracts aren't being renegotiated. However, they do have the right to strike in sympathy or not cross a picket line. And so, yeah, of course we're watching it closely, and we'll have to take that as it comes, those of us who are in production currently, and and yeah, and I'm sure we'll all have to, a strike would certainly throw most of our lives into a totally different mode, and that goes for crew members and for those of us producing and for directors and actors alike. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Eliza, did you want to then ask the next question?
Yeah, for sure. I think that we are all really interested to know, as independent and documentary producers, how can we support this initiative, this pending strike? And also, how can we be more organized as an industry? That's kind of two distinct questions, but I think they really complement each other. To that end, I also would love if anyone could step in and clarify what crossing a picket line would mean in this context. Yeah, I think just this question of support, we got an overwhelming number of responses about how can we be supportive as non-union filmmakers in this doc space, which is traditionally not unionized. So I would love for y'all to run with that.
Obviously, there's different questions. And so I'm going to actually start with what I think is the simplest one, which is regarding picket lines. And so jobs which would be working under the basic agreement and companies who are a part of the AMPTP would be the only jobs that would be faced with picketing. And so the likelihood that tier movies being covered by the low budget theatrical agreement, commercials, these other types of productions, the independent doc work that most of the persons watching this do, would not be faced with picket lines. And outside of them working at the major studios where the companies who are part of the AMPTP do their business. In those circumstances, there is typically a decision made by the studio to have a working entrance gate for persons who are doing secondary work or work not for the employer. And so that gate is considered safe for entry for persons who are working not for the employer being picketed. And then there is another gate where the strike is actually happening, where there's an actual picket line. Picket lines would have strike captains, so persons who are in contact with IA and their local leadership to assure that there are no conflicts, that things are maintained in an orderly way. It's a peaceful demonstration. I know that a lot of us, when we see images from strikes, they're often violent, and picket lines have become violent in the past, but the goal is whole nonviolence, a peaceful demonstration. And so if you were to show up to a location not knowing that it is typically the business is done there is done by companies under the AMPTP, and you found yourself with a picket line, it is recommended that you contact your production if you feel unsafe crossing the picket line, to inform them that there is a picket line and you do not feel safe crossing it. The picketers may engage in friendly dialogue regarding why they are picketing, but persons encountering the line have no obligation to join the line, especially if they're doing work for a secondary employer, i.e. an employer that is not being struck against. That's the bigger picture of it. I can only imagine how intimidating it would feel to come up and there's a picket line, right? And we're not at that stage of the game right now, and we don't expect to be, but again, that's a speculation on my behalf. And so, it's it's a lot of it is about being in contact with your production. If you feel like a job should be covered, oh, I got this offer for a job and I don't know if I'm going to be crossing a picket line. Then if you have a friend or colleague that is in one of the locals, contact them about passing information along to the local leadership as well as the IA, so that the IA can verify whether or not the work that you're about to engage in should be picketed or not. Okay, so then next question, I'm going to let Sam do. How do we support as non-union persons? Because I know that he knows a little bit about this.
Sure. Yeah. So I've obviously so in each union is different, and obviously we're a freelance industry. But as part of that, one of the strategies or methods that we have for organizing and just for looking out for the interests of our members is basically how to organize a job or how to get something under contract. Which one of the benefits is that I.A.T.S.E has, as we've alluded, we have a lot of different contracts that cover a lot of different budget levels and a lot of different genres. So that's beneficial in that, one of the kind of mantras is there's a contract for everybody, which is kind of true, because it's like, something it might be low budget, but it has a contract, so at least members are entitled to benefits and are able to have, again, a semblance of a quality of life because of that work. Even if some of the other things like a wage might not be what a basic contract would enforce, you might still be able to get some of the other benefits from being an I.A.T.S.E. That being said, I will say that one of the strategies we have, the main strategy, and this would be true even if we were striking, and how to support would be we report our jobs. So as union members, part of our obligation under I.A.T.S.E is to report our jobs, because we are freelance, and to figure out, well, is this job something that would be worth organizing, or is it something that would, it really isn't worth it because it's gonna wrap in a day or two, or it just isn't, it isn't feasible. And, as members, that just looks like forwarding a call sheet or sending that on and basically telling our local about it, and they would figure it out. It's out of our hands at that point. So it's not something that's challenging at all. But at the same time, I would also say that a lot of it comes down to just being aware of what the job is. And, if it were to come, for example, a hypothetical strike, again, this is uncharted territory, so it's a lot of speculation. But as we were leading up to it, a lot of our guidance was, if we did strike and you wanted to support, a lot of it would just be figuring out, is the work that is being as active at that point during an active strike, is that work something that would typically fall under the agreement that's being struck against, which I know is a hard way of it's not a clear way of putting it, but it's basically, if a giant show is working non-union during a strike, is that show something that would otherwise not be working if the strike wasn't happening? And the only way for us to know that, even as members, is to basically tell the union, and then we would have them look into it. Because it's like, I could be working a commercial, but a lot of times, and I was talking to another member recently, is like that area, and I'm sure you get to sometimes documentary too, because it's kind of a new thing with the way that genres have now started cross-pollinate in a lot of ways, of like, this is a commercial, but it's also promotional for this thing, or like for a documentary, it's like it's a promotional piece for a documentary. Like there's a lot of hybridization there now. And so the really only way for us to know as members is to tell, the local and be like, well, this is, kind of description of what we're working on. This is what it looks like. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And then if they had questions, they would obviously follow up with the production and ask directly, like, here's what we're, looking at striking against, and here's, kind of the guidelines, and does this fit in that mold or not? So it's it's tough, because I don't think even a lot of them really know, to be frank with you, because it's an uncharted territory, and it's a gray area in a lot of ways, because it's freelance, and we don't have any precedent for this to say, well, this contract is striking and this one's not, because we don't traditionally, or at least we haven't struck in the past. So it would be a new area for them to figure out as we go too. But that's kind of the overview of how it would work as a hypothetical. Obviously on the ground, and the pragmatic implications may be very different from that based on what actually would go down. But again, we're not as Matt said, we aren't at that point, nor foresee that happening anytime soon, because of the way that stuff happened the last week since this meeting was originally scheduled. It's changed a little bit, so that's kind of where we're at right now. Was there another specific question within that Matt and I may not have addressed, or Matt, if you want to follow up on something specific within that answer, or Chris too, of course.
Eliza, did we hit it all? I think we did.
Yeah, and I think it would be beneficial kind of to direct this conversation into a more specific space. I'm addressing a question that was asked in the chat, asking, is PBS a part of AMPTP, Netflix Docs, Hulu Docs, Apple Plus? Can you talk about how docs will be very directly affected? The reason I think this is an important question is because we received other questions from people via the email submission form regarding having a non-union contract on a non-union show for a specific network and whether continuing to work would constitute stabbing. Essentially, there's just a lot of, a lot of confusion about what support and solidarity looks like from a non-union and documentary perspective. From your answers, which were extremely helpful, what I was hearing is there are components. There are things we can be doing from our position. One of them is establishing contact with I.A.T.S.E, and the other would be thinking critically and compassionately about the type of work that we are doing and whether it would fall under the jurisdiction of something that should be struck against. So I'm wondering if you can apply that to some of these more specific questions, or if there's any way, this may be an oversimplification, but if there's any sort of like tells or like broad areas that are to be avoided during this time, or if a strike may occur.
I mean, I guess I'd say the most blatant would be, which I've also seen even just working, like, for example, commercials, which is totally unrelated to either conversation, but just an example, it's like we're seeing things where like we are being pushed to the limits, and we're basically, the productions are exhibiting symptoms that we are fighting in the bigger contract, which I think is abhorrent in a lot of ways, because it's like, some of it's just naivete and some of it is just, it's not really intentional, but the way that it comes across from an analytical or critical standpoint for us as members or people working and supporting, this type of work, is that when we see someone like in a commercial, even though we're not striking against them, to basically disregard our health and safety while we're fighting for that in another area of the exact same industry, I think that's very hurtful to us, because it's like, I'm working this and I'm providing you with my services and my skill set and really just my passion, because we all like what we do. But to have them then abuse it in a way that we're clearly fighting against in another realm of the same industry, I think is very, very challenging for us. It's definitely a cognitive dissonance. So I think, kind of as Eliza said, kind of the compassion perspective is very important, to be really just self-aware as producers or as productions, as a whole, to figure out, what are they fighting for, and are these things that we can kind of self-reflect on or be introspective about and look at and say, are we, aware of this, and are we respectful to that cause in our own work? And that's true not just for documentary, but for all genres, because it's like, obviously, we are all fighting for the same thing, and we're all humans at an individual level. So it's obviously something that we can all relate to on a fundamental level of, I don't want to be someone who has worked 17 hours and then goes home, putting yourself in those shoes and figuring out, is it appropriate, or is it something that you're just doing for the sake of saving, X amount of money, which I know is challenging, especially from a producer standpoint, but that's kind of the easiest answer I would give to that front. As far as, I guess, the question that Lisa asked in the chat about who's part of AMPTP, Matt, I think we have a list. I think there's a public list of all the signatories, if I'm not mistaken. And beyond that, I will say that a lot of these companies, again, kind of alluding to what I said earlier about there are now distinctions and ways that production companies are operating now that are very different from yesteryear, is that something like a Netflix doc, Netflix produces a lot of content. They're not a signatory. They kind of want to be, but they haven't officially become one yet. We don't have any special contracts.
I think they have become a member of the AMPTP recently, only like in the past month or something, because they didn't have a place at the bargaining table, they realized, and then they became a member.
Okay, so maybe Matt, yeah, maybe that is true. Maybe they just, I think, because we've been trying to get a separate contract with them, so maybe that's what I was thinking of.
Correct. So prior to the pandemic, the Netflix had approached the I.A.T.S.E about bargaining a contract for themselves, similar to how HBO has what we call the pay TV contract. The AMPTP for the first time included some of the tech companies such as Netflix, Apple, Amazon, Hulu. This is the first round of negotiations in the history of the industry that they have taken part in our basic agreement negotiations. They have not determined to us through official contract language how this exists, whether it says the AMPTP and Amazon, Hulu, like if it's like an and thing, or if now those company names will just fall under the AMPTP. We have yet to learn how that looks in a contract language way. But at this juncture, due to the fact that we only have a tentative agreement, that means that Netflix, Hulu, Apple, Amazon are not signatory companies. They are not beholden to IA. They typically sign one-off contracts in order to do jobs that they are producing themselves, or they purchase content from a third-party company that either produced it non-union or signatory. And when they kind of wash their hands of it in that manner, it puts them at a distance from having to be signatory because of the fact that they technically did not produce the content. They only purchased it after it was a product. PBS is not a part of the AMPTP. A lot of the public broadcasting stations either are either non-union or have individual local agreements within the region that they're working. And so in regard to how docs will be, I have not done a lot of work in the documentary world, but I know that it's a very challenging genre to work in because there's very little funding, there's very little support. And so oftentimes you have a very small team who do everything because, oh, we want to create content that has a social impact. We want to document this event that's happening to a marginalized community. We want to, in order to amplify their story, we want, like there's a million great reasons why members engage in documentary filmmaking, but what documentary filmmaking is not to the AMPTP is a profit-run business. They don't see big money in it, therefore they don't spend a lot of time on it. Sure, they'll buy it, right? They screen it and they're like, oh great, people will watch this, let's buy it, and probably for peanuts. Pardon my simplification of what goes on, because I know that a lot of people put a lot of hard work into it, but organizing that work is then very challenging when you only have a crew of 3 to 5 key people and you work for 36 months. And that's just the production of following someone around to see an overarching journey. And so how outside of quote unquote like largely funded documentaries, I would think it would be very challenging to then want to approach IA and say, we're making this documentary, we're really passionate about it, we want our members to receive, our crew members to receive benefits, but this is self-financed. So how do we give the people who are working on this what we feel they are owed, but then simultaneously we have nothing to give outside of the wages we barely have? Like I'm eating ramen in order to make this happen, and that's a systemic issue to a certain extent that I think has always existed in the documentary world, where people do it out of the passion for not only storytelling but for story amplifying, right? You want to have voices that would go unheard be heard. I'm on a tangent because I do that. Pardon my tangent. And so Sam had covered a lot about this. I don't know if Chris has, because Chris actually works in this world, and so I would love to hear his 2 cents about this.
Yeah, I just wanted, thanks. That was awesome, Mac. Actually, Matt, I love your tangents. Actually, that's we've had a few of them on separate phone calls, and I appreciate you so much. One note I do want to leave, because do want to move on to the Q&A, is that at the minimum for non-union emerging filmmakers, this is an incredible education. I think with everything that's happening on, the question comes up a lot of times, like what is the value of my work and my skill as a technician, as a producer? What does that mean? And when you don't have these guardrails and contracts, there's a lot of open territory, open waters for sharks to circle. And so to Matt's point about documentary filmmakers often working for passion and for amplifying voices and those things, I think one thing to be vigilant about and to look out for is when you are on, and now a lot of things are online, when you're on these websites that are offering jobs and gigs and things of that nature, that you're really, really keeping an eye out for those that are predatory, because those sites are extremely predatory and can be, not all the time, but they can be. And when you see a multi-million, multi-billion-dollar company offering a job that is typically what is half a day rate to film, do sound, edit, all of these things, like, I think that's where we can have the most impact, is like really being spot on and like reporting that stuff and really bringing it to light. Because I think that's where, even with the strike, Matt, like we talked about, like even if there was a strike, there's a lot of things where there's backdoor deals where people can loophole into these other areas. So we kind of have to just kind of keep our eyes out for all of that.
There's something to be said about self-organizing, and what Chris is addressing is very prevalent even in the narrative community, where people want to create content and oftentimes don't have budgets to pay, quote unquote, fair wages, and so they turn to sites, job boards, in order to crew productions. And so there's a lot to be said about self-organizing and being a part of forums where below the line persons, or like your classification persons, are connected, so that if you are offered something, I was offered this thing from this company, has anyone heard of this company? They did not offer me very much, but I am interested, and so I want to hear if anyone else has ever been connected to these persons. And then from that self-organizing standpoint, people can hold the line to make sure that I'm going to pass on this, make sure you don't take this, so that we can bring the wage up, right? This is much easier to do in smaller markets than it is in larger markets. Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta, it can be harder to hold the line because there's a lot of people in line behind you to be offered that job. But in some of the other markets, when the community gets that much smaller, it's much easier to organize and assure that, they're not paying a decent wage for this, they're asking too much, they want someone to do all of these things, and it really should be separated positions. And so everybody hold the line on this one, and we'll make sure that people get what they're owed.
Great. Well, I know that we are running a little bit over, but I know that we had several questions that people submitted that we didn't really get to. And I want to make sure we answer any questions that people have that are watching right now. So I'll ask one question now, and then if there are any other questions, if you can just drop them in the Q&A, we'll try and answer them really fast. I think one of the things that I'm interested in that someone asked as well is sort of the changes. I think Matt and Sam, you both talked about the changes in the last 10 years, but specifically like the last 5, and the dominance of streaming culture and how that has been affecting what's going on with your work. And I think, I imagine, Luke, is similar to documentary, like it is a different thing when you are making something independently and then selling it to Netflix, as opposed to, like, we all have the same bosses ultimately, but it seems like somehow we're falling into this different bucket because of when it gets acquired, whether it's commissioned or not. So I guess a roundabout way of trying to talk about the changes we're seeing in streaming, like what are those changes and how can they be, I don't know, addressed? Are they problematic or not? And that's for sort of everyone.
what I will say, which will tie into actually what we've been fighting for in this negotiation, is what we call streaming residuals, and basically the differentiation that the contract did have previously, or at least it will have until this contract becomes ratified, if it does. Basically, there's a multi-tier system within even the same contract for us for different types of content. So like if it is for streaming specifically, there was a different way of treating it. And that was based on the fact, and this goes back to the timeline you mentioned, of, originally this was written into the contract such that it was, we're figuring it out, this is experimental and streaming isn't that big a thing. And now it's obviously become the dominant way of doing things for a lot of these companies and even just the industry at large. So that's one of the things I guess I would point out, is just that this has changed in the way that, like, the biggest change that you're asking us to kind of point out is, and to me, that biggest change is just the dominance of this and how that's influencing discussion of how we negotiate, as well as, I'm sure even as producers figuring out how do you pitch this, or how do you figure out where this fits in the lineup, because this is now the dominant platform, and this is, one, the company you have to deal with, and two, the type of audience that you're trying to figure out how to cater to. So that would be, I guess, my simple answer, is just that these are things that have changed dramatically just by nature of the platform, and that we're dealing with this as a change just because of the way that the market has now situated itself to have this as the exhibition platform of choice.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, for independent producers, I mean, a big part of the way that we would get paid in the past was, well, we might get an upfront fee that's low, but we might have back-end participation in a film or profit participation going forward. And those profits would come out of box office performance and then sale to TV, transactional, eventually transactional VOD and subscription VOD at the end of it. Now it's only subscription VOD, and there's no these companies don't release any information about performance of a film. And there's no profit participation whatsoever after that fact. So it really changes the revenue model for how producers work. And we're figuring that out too, similar to what Sam said. A lot of our business models came into being around theatrical and around television. And so residual, like Sam said, for the IA, the residuals are paid into the healthcare benefits and the healthcare program. And then for SAG, DGA, and WGA, it actually goes into the members' pockets. And so they're trying to figure that out too, figuring out how residuals are paid on streaming content. So it's an interesting, it's an interesting period of flux in our industry.
Okay, we have one question that we got in the chat, and I'm not entirely sure I understand it. But it's about, let's see, as a director, I try and make my set and production workflow accessible and safe to all. One of my supervisors also has a disability and makes us all feel safe, but 12 years in, that's not okay. What are steps you have taken in your organizing efforts to push more directors to set that safety net in place? Also not in a union, how do I join? I'm in Chicago. I know that some of us are in Chicago, so maybe they can address that.
In the question itself, I would think that the directors are part of the DGA. And so it's a guild and not a union. And so if this person were wanting to work in the below the line crafts, that's different than becoming a DGA member. And I don't know the path to DGA membership personally, but I'm sure that someone, Chris might know, maybe Chris does.
Yeah, no, loosely, I know there's a credit qualification and a couple other things, but I will put that specific link into the resource guide just so we have that, like especially like for different areas like the PGA and DGA and things of that nature. I do want to drop in a great resource into the chat too for non-union freelancers. It's freelancersunion.org. Matt, to your point about workers uniting, holding the line, it's an incredible organization. They do a lot of work. And there's a tremendous amount of information on non-union freelancers and like what your rights are and how y'all can, how we can band together. Yeah, there, and the same thing for the local 600 camera and other I.A.T.S.E qualifications. We can also put that in there as well because they're very specific qualifications on how to join the union. And also at which stage of your career, there's several different job classifications as well.
I think another part of the question was a little bit about DEI and safe working environments, right? Creating space for persons who either have a disability or fall into an underrepresented category. And for me personally, that's connecting with and assuring that persons from underrepresented categories not only receive training, but then are given just job opportunities. It's not just about offering jobs, it's about offering jobs at competitive rates that are real opportunities to grow and further establish careers. It has to be more than about bringing people in at the bottom. It also has to be about making space at the top for persons to tell their own stories. Especially as a director, I've seen this succeed and fail. It's a very difficult thing to enact. I was recently on a commercial that had DEI initiatives, and they had hired an older cisgender white man as the director, but also had hired a younger Latinx woman to co-direct, quote unquote. But it wound up really just being the older director kind of bulldozing everything, and she just kind of twiddled her thumbs and was there for, and she knew what it was, and she even in private called out what it was, that it was a diversity hire for the sake of checking a box as opposed to giving her a real opportunity. And so even when companies are trying, sometimes the way that they try means a lot. From my perspective, I don't do that hiring, but if they wanted to try, they should have let this young woman direct, not hired two people that don't even know each other. It's not like they're directing partners and have been doing it for years together. This was a squandered opportunity for them to actually have a young director learn what it takes to be a director. And so that's what this is about. This is about bringing people up and giving them true opportunities. And even when it doesn't go well, giving them more opportunities. Like there's a obscene study about how when female directors' first movies don't do very well, that they often don't get, or it takes a much longer time for them to get a second opportunity compared to when men fail constantly, but are given more and more opportunities. And so making space means making space. It means taking a step back and allowing underrepresented persons to be not only hired in the lowest positions, but leaders as well. Moving on.
Yeah, we do have one final question, which has been chatted to us. And I'll read it here. I'm curious if people have thoughts on creating a more bottom-up model of unionizing freelance film workers rather than top-down. I generally see people above the line being the first to get representation rather than PAs and other people on set who don't have representation or support. How do we move forward in creating more inclusive unions that start with the most exploited workers rather than the most established?
This is a very tricky question to answer. PAs don't have representation right now. Most persons who come in as production assistants don't want to stay production assistants. They want to move on to writing, directing, cinematography. They find a niche working in sound or in lighting, or they typically don't. And so the high turnover rates of the production assistant category create a challenge in organizing because typically PAs don't stay within that classification for an extended period of time. Even PAs who, I got onto an episodic television show during season 1, and then in season 2, I moved up and I was the key PA, and then in season 3, I was the DGA trainee, and now it's season 5, and I'm the second, right? They're on a path to becoming a DGA member, which is a guild and not a union. And so even when PAs are in the track of mentorship within, from PA being the bottom, it's typically towards the DGA, a guild, not union representation through I.A.T.S.E. And so, and because the other side of this coin of the exploited workers is that, I.A.T.S.E. members are represented, and we're represented by a union that is 125 years old. And so becoming a union member is challenging depending on what union you're trying to join. There's no doubt about that. But representation is available. And if you connect with members of the union that you want to join, typically they're willing to help you to understand how to become a member, the steps to becoming a member, and will fight on your behalf to join, because they typically are part of that union because they know that representation matters.
Just to say, similar to what you were saying about self-organizing, Matthew, I mean, I would say also, like, if you feel frustrated in the work that you're doing, the great thing about these unions is that they all started from, and the guilds alike, all started from people recognizing a problem and organizing. And if the production assistants organize and want to become a part of the IA and push to become a part of the IA or the DGA or another organization, or to start their own organization, it's really going to come within that group themselves.
Agreed. It's not impossible. It's just challenging. And like the producers union, which you have started, which was groundbreaking in and of itself, a production assistance union would not only be groundbreaking, but would require a lot of self-organizing. But it can happen, because if enough people are interested in seeing better, wages, treatment on set, then the way to make it happen is through having a collective voice.
Yeah, it sounds like what you guys are saying is a lot of the way people talk about, like, McDonald's workers organizing or Starbucks worker, that people come in and out. And so it's like a hard industry to organize, because people don't necessarily stay there for a long time. But that then by design means that those are positions that are just inherently and regularly exploited. So I wonder, and probably this is like a much longer conversation, is like how to have like a more structured apprenticeship program that other trades unions have, where, if you want to be a mason, if you want to be a carpenter, you come in and there's an apprenticeship program. And if that is something that might be more readily available, which doesn't even speak to how there just really are not unions in documentary sort of in general. So how to even have that in documentary would be hard for me to even wrap my head around.
Well, like Matthew was mentioning too, the DGA trainee program is actually a great program. It's maybe too selective. There are only a few DGA trainees chosen at a given time, but it is, and I believe that came out of an idea that the DGA was too exclusive. And there was too much nepotism among the membership. I think this was many, many decades ago and years ago. And they created this trainee program so that people could start out as trainees and work their way up to guild membership. And I think it's a good model for that. It's not perfect, but it's an interesting model for that kind of apprenticeship.
I can also drop in the chat, Field of Vision just established an apprenticeship program that's specific to documentary filmmaking. There's like a post and a production division. And I think it's a really interesting like program and would be very cool to watch other groups and organizations adopt a model that is conducive to training and like fostering and nurturing filmmaking talent in the doc space.
A unique challenge that other industries don't face compared to the motion picture industry is that they work in one place, right? Oh, I'm a carpenter and I'm going to bring on an apprentice and I have one workshop. And so it is easy then to organize when you have one singular place that everyone comes to work at, as opposed to the motion picture industry where there might be the studios, but location work has now become the norm compared to studio work. And so it creates that unique challenge in organizing because of the fact that everyone is extremely spread out. And so approaching persons about organizing is difficult just due to locations. And someone in the chat had said +1 on apprenticeship rather than exploited internship, which I agree wholeheartedly. I am fortunate to be on a show right now that has paid internships that people are brought into specific departments, can only work a certain amount of hours a day, are paid the entire time that they are present. And the goal is for these persons to not only gain experience, but then also gain entrance into specific unions. And I'm grateful for the company that I'm working for taking the time to support this initiative, because it seems to be working very well in persons being paid to gain the experience needed to work in the industry.
All right, thank you so much. This has been, I think, a really incredible conversation that is like helping me and hopefully others to learn. We are coming up on our time limit, so I think it's prudent to wrap this up. As we've been mentioning intermittently throughout, we have created a resource guide and we'll be incorporating parts of this conversation and resources that we've just now added into it and then distributing it. So thank you to all attendees for joining us, and thank you so much to all panelists for joining and contributing. It's time to go, but I hope this is the beginning of many conversations across different parts of the industry with union and non-union participants. I just think that this communication and transparency is so critical, and many others are feeling the same way. So this is a very valuable resource, and thank you to you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.